One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and is the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. At the end of 2023, I completed a mini-series centered on the concepts of VO2 max and how your aerobic capacity is a solid predictor of longevity. Basically, your ability to take oxygen in through your lungs and to use that oxygen to make energy for your cells is absolutely critical for every aspect of human function. And by extension, your health and wellness is in many ways limited or capped when your VO2 max is reduced. And so we spent time talking about how to assess and improve your aerobic capacity with both zone 2 and interval style training. And if you haven't listened to those episodes, as we go into 2024, most of us thinking about, hey, I'm going to exercise this year, like making 2024 the best year ever. If you haven't listened to those episodes on cardiorespiratory health and zone 2 and interval training, you might really need to go back and grab that information if it's something you don't already know. So today we're going to start another mini series where we're going to focus on the other side of the exercise equation, because being healthy and well is not just about the absence of disease, but it's about the presence of a vital capacity to live in and engage in the world, especially with the people that you love. And you may have heard me say before that your VO2 max and your aerobic capacity improves longevity, but the other side of longevity is quality of life. And while I would never reduce your quality of life to just this factor alone, quality of life is very much dependent on your ability to remain physically independent and to have the strength and the muscular endurance to do the things that are important and necessary. And you're sick of hearing me say this, but remember the mantra: the goal is to die young, as old as possible. And so the next topic is about using resistance training or weightlifting to build or rebuild or maintain muscle mass and physical capacity. It's about why you need to do it and how to do it to get maximum results in minimum time, if that's a concern. And for this series, obviously this is the introductory episode, but for this series, I'm going to make a few assumptions. First of all, I'm going to assume that you're not an athlete. But even if you were, the needs of an athlete versus a non-athlete, just the regular average North American, the needs between those two groups of people differ in magnitude, not in kind. Meaning that as a non-athlete, you can do everything that athletes do. You just don't do it as much. You don't do it as hard or as heavy or as fast, and maybe not as often. And so your needs versus an athlete differ in magnitude, not in kind. The second thing I'm going to assume is that you're not like me in the sense that I love to lift weights. I love to lift weights, especially heavy weights. I enjoy the process itself and I enjoy the challenge. To me, it's my own internal competition, but most people see it as either entirely dispensable. They don't really care about it, even though they may know that there's benefits to it. So they either see it as entirely dispensable, or maybe they see it as a necessary evil and they do it begrudgingly. And so I'm going to assume that at some level, you're at least willing to do resistance training, maybe not because you love it, but mostly because you understand how important it is. That's part of my goal with this mini-series. But I'll tell you that something magic happens when someone who is, let's say, ambivalent to resistance training does it enough to see their body change and their function change. There is a built-in positive, self-reinforcing aspect to resistance training that can take the most ambivalent of us and turn us into true believers. And, honestly, my wife was one of those when we first started dating, which was, 26, 27 years ago now. I should know that number precisely, but we just had our 25th anniversary. So, 26 years ago. When we started dating, she went to the gym with me not because she loved the gym, but because we were dating, right? And when you meet someone that you think might be a potential mate, you want to do things to be in sync with them. You want to do things to impress them. And so, but as she saw how much being stronger made her feel and how it changed her physique, she fell in love with the process, right? She didn't start out loving it, but now she does. Now she lifts weights, not just because of what it does for her in so many senses of that word, but because if she doesn't feel good. She can't function as well. And she's fallen in love with it for its own sake. And now it's just part of her lifestyle. The third thing I'm going to assume is that you are either starting from ground zero, which means you have either never done any kind of resistance training or perhaps haven't for a very long time. And the cool thing about that is that there's something in the world of fitness called newbie gains or beginner gains. We call it newbie gains. And this is where an untrained person responds to exercise and lifting weights faster and more robustly than someone who has been training for years. And so know that once you have several years of training under your belt, it takes a lot of effort just to get like 5% better than where you are. But that's not true for beginners. That's not true for newbies. Newbies can go into the gym and sneeze and get results. Well, not exactly, but you get my point. And these newbie gains can last for the first entire year of their training, assuming that they're doing it consistently. And then finally, I'm going to assume that you might have some metabolic challenges that lower your exercise tolerance. And it's not uncommon for people, specifically people that I work with, because I tend to work with people who are not well. But it's not uncommon for people who are inflamed and fatigued, maybe they have thyroid issues, whatever the case might be. And not to say that those are excuses to do nothing, but it's not uncommon for people who are in that metabolic state to have very low or no exercise tolerance to the point where they either limit what they do in the gym, how often they go, and sometimes they just stop at all. But here's my point to you is that despite your metabolic challenges, there is a starting point for you that will challenge your system enough to start to cause some adaptations, but not so much that your system doesn't crash. And sometimes the trick is to find that balance point for each individual person. So I'm going to assume that you have some metabolic challenges, and maybe you have some degree of exercise intolerance, which means that you have to have some graded way to approach exercise that you can start doing something. Because doing something is always better than doing nothing, right? Because doing something will consistently increase your capacity to do more later. And so it becomes a stepping stone. So those are my assumptions. And what I want to do now is talk about some myths and misconceptions, because every person that I take on as a personal coaching client, we end up talking about exercise at some point in their progression, and it's different for most people. But every once in a while when this topic comes up, someone objects to resistance training because they have some misconception, either about what it takes to get results or how it will affect them. And so let's deal with these myths and misconceptions once, because if those are holding you back, I'd rather get those off the table so that you realize that maybe how you're thinking about exercise and resistance training particularly, maybe is a little bit flawed. And I guess I probably should be delicate in how I say that, but that's how I think. So the first myth or misconception is that resistance training is only for athletes. Old school trainers used to say, and I've heard other people say this, that if you have a body, you're an athlete. And there is truth to that, because the sport that most of us play is the sport of life. And if you think of it this way, every sport involves competitors whose sole objective is to make you lose so that they can win. And life is like that. If you have a heart attack or a stroke, you lose. If you lose your physical independence as you age and someone has to wipe your butt and bathe you, you lose. If you are in the grandparent stage and you can't play with or pick up your grandkids, or maybe you have young kids and you're a young parent or a middle-aged parent, if you can't play with or pick up your kids, you lose. And so your primary competitors in the sport of life are, we've already talked about poor cardiorespiratory health, because that reduces your longevity. But you have other competitors, right? Like we have a loss of quality of life that can come from loss of muscle mass, loss of muscle strength, speed, and power. And we'll dive into some of these things and give you some details about this. Another competitor is physical frailty, right? Because as you lose muscle mass, maybe lose bone density, increase your body fat, and become sedentary, you lose your independence. That's what you're fighting against. And to throw one more in there that, maybe might surprise you a little bit, but there's a rising risk of cognitive decline through neurodegenerative disease, including dementia, that you can hedge your bets against those by moving your physical body. And at some point through this mini-series, we'll talk about some of the cognitive effects of exercise, or why in my circles, we say movement is medicine for the brain, or nutrition for the brain. Now, there was a time back in the 60s and 70s where really the only people who lifted weights were athletes and bodybuilders. And the athletes were, they were typically either engaged in athletics like Olympic sports, or football players is the big classic one. But that's only because they were the first ones that clued into the value of resistance training. Not that that was discovered in the 60s and 70s, because we have archaeological evidence of different types of training tools and implements that go back thousands of years to the ancient Persians, the ancient Indians, and so on. But again, in our time, in our era, it was only because bodybuilders and certain athletes like football players discovered that if they were physically stronger, they did better. And now we know that everybody needs to develop and maintain a baseline of physical strength and muscular endurance if we are to expect not just longevity, but longevity with good quality of life, with good physical capacity. And these days, you and I are faced with a problem that our ancestors never had to deal with, and that is a modern sedentary lifestyle. Back before the Industrial Revolution and the invention of things like factories and machines that were used to automate work, people did hard physical labor every single day. So now, unless you currently live on a farm and have to sling hay bales all day long, or unless you have to chop wood just to be able to cook or heat your home, chances are you're not getting the daily muscle activation and development that you need to be truly healthy. And the importance of resistance training, either in a gym setting or at home, is not because the idea of strengthening your muscles is new, but because as a society, we have lost something that our forebears did out of necessity. Because the strong survived and the weak didn't. And you got strong doing hard work because that was what life was like back in the day. So you and I have a choice. Either go old school and become farmers and lumberjacks, or start adding regular resistance training to your weekly routine. So that's myth and misconception number one, that lifting weights doesn't apply to you because you're not an athlete. The second misconception is that lifting weights will make you bulky. And this one is typically only a concern for my female clients, but it is unfounded. Gender has nothing to do with it. And I would say that part of the problem is that we often look at people who do weight training, for example, female powerlifters or perhaps competitive female bodybuilders, and we start to connect dots in ways that we shouldn't. And it goes kind of something like this. Like you look at a female bodybuilder, especially professionals, and you go, okay, well, female bodybuilders lift weights to look like they do, which is comparatively bulky and less feminine. I don't want to be like a female bodybuilder, therefore I should never lift weights because that's why they are the way they are. And that might seem logical on the surface, but the first thing you need to know is that most competitive female bodybuilders take steroids and other growth and performance enhancers. And you also need to know that these people train an insane amount, and they have to do that for years to get to the point where they have enough muscle that they can even be competitive. And that's far more necessary than what you and I would need to do to optimize our health and wellness, because that's just what it takes to be a competitive bodybuilder or a competitive powerlifter. And even if we look at natural female bodybuilders who don't take steroids and really are just some kind of like simply scaled down versions of the pharmaceutically enhanced ones. Or if we look at new categories of say, physique competitors or bikini competitors who are certainly lean and muscular and still in many cases very feminine, the amount of work and time that it takes to become that is far more than I am suggesting that you need to do to optimize health. And I don't want to belabor the point, but this is only a concern if you really don't have a knowledge base of what resistance training is, what it can do for you, and what it takes, or that it takes very hard work over many years, plus steroids in many cases, for a woman to get bulky and masculine. And I'll say this and then I'll move on. It is possible to get stronger and to develop more endurance with your muscles without adding significant amounts of muscle. You just take what you have and make it better. And it all depends on what you do and how you do it. You get to control how your body responds to the resistance training by choosing what you do and how you do it. And finally, the average female simply doesn't have genetics. The genetics are certainly not the hormonal profile with a much lower male type hormone like testosterone and DHT and androstenedione. Their levels are so much lower than what men have, and it's so much lower than what is required to just automatically put muscle on that you don't want. And if I were to pull the curtain back and let you in on a little secret, most guys who lift weights can't add muscle without significant effort. There are some genetic freaks, if you will, out there that kind of come into the gym, come into the world, if you will, with bigger bone structures, more dense muscles. And these are the ones that they can be big and strong without actually lifting. But if they do, it's like crazy. Most guys have to invest a lot of time, a lot of effort, even naturally over years with proper diet, good nutrition, sleep, stress control, all of that stuff. Guys have to work hard to put on muscle. And it's just not that easy for women. And so bottom line is lifting is not going to make you bulky unless that's what you want. And maybe you can't really get bulky because your genetics and hormones don't really support that. It's not something that you should fear. And it's certainly not anything that should keep you away from resistance training, especially given the potential benefit. It will help you create the best version of your physique and your figure. And as many as noted, is a little off color for me. Who doesn't want to look great naked? There was actually a book by that title by Brad Schoenfeld, Look Great Naked, many, many, many years ago. All right, that's conception or misconception number 2. Misconception number 3 is that lifting weights takes too long, and I just don't want to live in the gym, or I don't like the gym, and I don't like going to the gym, so I can't lift weights. Well, you can do anything that you can do in a gym, you can do at home. You might have to have different versions, but that's no excuse. Location is not an excuse, and time isn't really either. Because how much time you spend at the gym or at home lifting weights is really, it's up to you. But that decision of how much time you have to invest should be driven by your goals and what you're trying to accomplish. And so maybe you only have 30 minutes twice a week to devote to this. And the truth is that if you're smart about it, you can get great results with resistance training only twice a week. Now, you're not going to become Ms. Olympia. You're not going to be a physique competitor and be up on the stage, but you will be better than you are right now if you approach it right. If you have more time, great. You can invest more and get more adaptations. It really is up to you and what you want out of the process. And on a side note, you might know, or perhaps you've committed this in the past, some people do spend 2 to 3 hours in the gym, but because they treat it like a social event, right? Effective programming can have you in and out of the gym with your gym work, 45 minutes, maybe less. Like let's just say 45 minutes. But if that's all you have, then you can do a lot if you're focused and if you're dedicated, if you don't get distracted, right? So you can't either go into the gym or work out at home with people around you, get constantly distracted, chat with your friends, hop on your phone on social media, and all of a sudden what should take 45 minutes takes you an hour and a half. I completely understand that the timeline is a potential turnoff, but not when you're focused. I use headphones. Like, people don't bother me in the gym because I have my headphones in. I listen to music that I find motivating when I'm lifting. And I don't know, maybe I walk around with a scowl on my face, but it's not like people approach me just to strike up a conversation. So there are ways to insulate yourself against the potential for a 45-minute workout to turn into something that's quite a bit longer than that. How about number 4, misconception number 4? Well, doc, I don't need to lift weights because I do yoga or I do Pilates. Listen, I love these body weight systems. I have no problem with yoga. I have no problem with Pilates, bar. The new thing now is animal flow, which I think has tremendous potential to help people. But, while you can do a lot with body weight type systems like yoga, Pilates, and so on, none of these systems or methods are going to deliver everything that you need them to. And you max out these body weight approaches pretty quickly, where the only way to progress and get better beyond where you are is to add external resistance. And to be honest, nobody said that you can't combine yoga with weightlifting, right? Adding some intelligent resistance exercises can get better results than what you're getting right now. Plus, it will make your yoga better. And to be honest, your yoga will probably make your weightlifting better. So if you're already doing yoga or Pilates, think addition, not substitution. I'm not saying lift weights instead of these things. I'm saying you can do both. And I get it that many people don't want to lift weights, but the problem is that your physical body needs what it needs, and it doesn't care how you feel about it. It doesn't care that you might not be really cranked up about resistance training. It needs what it needs, period. Misconception number 5 is that it takes too long to see progress. I don't want to work out for 6 months and, I'm going to get discouraged because my body never changes. Well, I would say that if that's true in the past, that's probably 2 things: poor programming and perhaps poor nutrition and recovery. I guess that's 3 things. But here's the deal. If you're on point, if your diet is reasonable, and if your workout plan is reasonable and you're consistent, you will feel different in 3 to 4 weeks. You will feel it. Now, others won't notice. Others won't notice the changes in you for perhaps 8 to 10 weeks. But if you're consistent over, say, an 8 to 10 week period, you're going to start getting comments like, hey, are you going to the gym? Are you working out? You look leaner. Your posture's changed. You've got a glow to you. And part of this is back to the newbie gains, right? Where that untrained person responds faster and better to simple lifting than, say, someone who's got 3 years of lifting under their belt. Newbie gains are a great boon, and you can feel changes in a very short period of time. Others will begin to notice a change. And if you invest 3 months, 4 months, 16 weeks or so, you can make significant difference. And I'm not saying you work out for 4 months and then stop. That's silly. I'm just saying that you can accomplish a lot in the first 4 months of training. And as a newbie, you can continue to see very, very, very beneficial changes up to the year before you really have to kind of gear down and go, okay, if I want to keep progressing past this one, I have to work a lot harder. That first year for a beginner is magic. So here's the problem in a nutshell. Like, once we hit 40 years old, that seems to be the magic number for so many different things. Once we hit about 40, we start to lose about 1% of muscle mass per year. And that's important and it's significant, but it's not the critical factor. I mean, it's all associated, right? Everything is connected, because as we lose muscle mass, we also lose strength. Less muscle mass typically means less strong or weaker. And we'll talk about this in another episode, but your strength is linked to, but not synonymous with, muscle mass. And in general, the more muscle you have, the stronger you are. But while the two are linked, they are, say, independent enough that you can increase one without significantly increasing the other. However, when you lose muscle, you do lose strength. That's an absolute. So once we hit 40, we lose about 1% of muscle mass per year. After 40, that translates to about 2 to 4% of our strength gone every single year that we don't do something to get it back and preserve it. So we lose strength at roughly double the rate, sometimes up to quadruple the rate of the muscle size that we lose. But that's not all. As we lose muscle size and strength, we also lose muscle power, which is essentially the rate at which we can apply the strength that we have. And again, these concepts are all interlinked, but they are different. mass or size is different than strength, which is different than speed, which is different than power, but they're all interlinked. So, and this is really the key problem with aging and frailty, and why losing muscle mass is so deleterious and why adding back muscle is so important, is that when we lose muscle, for every 1%, 2% of muscle mass that we lose, our muscle power goes down by 8 to 10%. And that's where things really start to get you. So in reality, it's the loss not just of muscle mass or size that gets you, but the loss of strength and, more importantly, power. So let me give you a real world application or example. Let's say that you're deconditioned and you're under muscled, and you're walking down the street and someone on a bicycle is coming towards you on the sidewalk, but they don't see you. You see them, but they don't. And at the last minute, you see that you're going to get hit. So the question is, are you strong enough and fast enough to move your body out of the way so there's no collision? Or let's say that you're walking down the stairs with, I don't know, maybe several bags of groceries or a laundry basket in your hands, something awkward, right? And you accidentally trip or stumble. Are you fast enough and strong enough to catch yourself so that you don't tumble down and break a leg or break your arm or hit your head and get a concussion? And it's easy to see how, these examples are hazardous, certainly for someone, say, in their 70s or 80s, who risks breaking a hip if they fall. But where do you think the loss of muscle, size, strength, and power started for an 80-year-old? It started in their 40s. But they either didn't know or they didn't care about things like muscle loss and the reductions that come in power and strength that comes with every year after 40 that they've aged. It is an irrefutable fact of life, and nobody is exempt, not even you. If you don't lift weights, you will lose muscle, size, strength, power, and that's not good for you. Now, I said earlier, muscle size, strength, power, I even mentioned speed, are all interconnected. These are some of the adaptations that happen when you do resistance training. And so very quickly, and we'll come back to this along the way throughout the series, here is what can change when you lift weights. Again, depending on how you do it, you emphasize one or the other. It's not like they all happen to equal amounts. It just depends on how you train. So you can change your programming to increase size, or you can change your programming to increase your speed, or you can change your programming to focus on power or strength. Or you can get a modest amount of each of those things rather than specializing in one. So one adaptation is speed, and that's just simply how fast you can contract your muscles. And this is important for maintaining balance and simple things like preventing falls. And believe it or not, it's how quickly your muscles can contract that prevents your back from going out when you bend over to pick up a sock. In the years that I spent practicing chiropractic, until I understood better about the muscular system and biomechanics, it was always wondrous to me that most people I worked with who had acute back pain, who threw their back out, so to speak, or herniated a disc, it wasn't because they were trying to pick up a car to save someone who was trapped underneath it. It wasn't that they were bending over to try to pick up 100-pound rock in their garden. It was because they bent over to pick up something simple like a sock. And that's because as you bend over and you increase the load on your spine, your muscles have to contract very quickly to stabilize against that movement. They call it a moment arm. And so the faster your muscles can contract, assuming you have adequate strength to hold your body in place, the better. But if your muscles can't contract and adapt to a new position, like bending over to pick up a sock, boom, your back goes out. That's a speed issue. It's not necessarily an absolute strength issue. A lot of physical therapists or chiropractors will say, well, your back keeps going out because you're weak. And that might be true, but I can guarantee your back goes out because you've lost the speed of contraction. All right, I could go off on that one, and let's just keep going down the list. So one adaptation is speed. Another is power, right? Which I said earlier is the combination of strength and speed. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. But again, the key thing is it's the loss of power that is most responsible for the rapid onset of the loss of physical capacity as we age, more so than muscle mass and absolute strength. But again, they're all interconnected. So we have speed, we have power, we also have strength. and I've said in many podcasts in the past, even recently, your physical strength as you age is one key and a predictor to the quality of life as you get older. So we have speed, we have power, we have strength, and then we have muscle size or muscle mass. And this is a tricky one. And I'll talk about some misconceptions about this. But for now, many of you that are listening, you have less muscle than you should for your height and your frame size. And so adding muscle or size, muscle mass or size, it's not about getting big. It's just, sometimes it's simply about getting back the amount of muscle that you need, and it's about filling a deficit. You don't necessarily have to pack on so much muscle that you start to look like a power lifter or a bodybuilder. That's not the point. The point is, do you have the minimum amount for your frame and for your height to contribute to your health? And then finally, another muscular adaptation to resistance training is what we call muscular endurance. And this is different from the endurance that we talked about that comes from cardio training, right? If you remember in that last series, we talked about zone 2 and interval training to increase your VO2 max, which is your aerobic capacity. That increases the endurance of your heart and lungs, which is more of a global phenomenon. But you can be specific. You can increase the endurance of a specific muscle or group of muscles without having much of a systemic impact. Now, the bigger the muscle group is that you're exercising, the more potential it is to have a systemic impact. So for example, if I'm exercising, and I'll be ridiculous here, if I'm exercising my fingers might get stronger and have more endurance. That's not going to have a global impact. But if I do deadlifts or squats, which is a whole body exercise, or maybe I'm doing kettlebell work, and many movements in kettlebells are full body exercises, then because I'm using so much of my body at one time, yes, that's going to have a systemic impact. But here's an example of developing local muscular endurance. If you've listened to me before, I know I've shared back in 2022, I had shoulder surgery for a torn rotator cuff and bicep tendon and cartilage. And as you can imagine, you have your original injury, but then you cut into the shoulder to repair all that. And then when you come out of the surgery, everything is weak. All your muscles are atrophied, right? So the muscle actually shrinks and weakens, not just from the initial injury, but from the surgery itself. And so after my surgery, literally my brain didn't want me to move my shoulder because it was injured, and then it was cut open and then was repaired and sewn up again. But after a few days, I started a graded rehab program, and I did all my own rehab myself just because I have that background. But we started with passive mobilization to increase range of motion and blood flow. So that's movement without contracting my own muscles. My wife helped me with that. But at some point, I had to start using the muscles themselves. First goal is to improve blood flow, range of motion, but it's also to teach the brain, hey, it's okay to move this again. You have to get over that sticking point. But you have to start very, very small because there's no strength and there's no endurance. And so at some point, I started to use rubber bands, very light ones, very light resistance, to get back a little bit of strength, but to start to build endurance and resilience. But of course, my ability to generate force with my shoulder muscles was seriously compromised by its lack of endurance. So just a few repetitions of very low force contractions caused my shoulder muscles to fatigue to the point where I had to stop and rest. And there was only so much I could do in those first couple of weeks. So in the beginning, I had to focus on developing local muscular endurance by using very light resistance and doing more and more repetitions. And over time, as my shoulder fatigued less with that same work, I could then increase the resistance. I could handle more work. And so it was a stair-stepping process of developing endurance with low resistance and then progressing to a little more resistance as my endurance at that level of resistance improved. And little by little, I got to the point where my shoulder now is pretty much as good as it's ever been. In fact, I'm as strong now at 59 as I was a student in postgrad back in my 20s. But, the endurance I developed in my shoulder did nothing for my global endurance capacity, which is why you need to do a whole bunch of different things to get all of the benefits of exercise that we need. We need the cardiorespiratory work. We also need the resistance training, right? It's not like doing shoulder rehab improved my VO2 max. It did not. But it's a good place to remind you that the adaptations you get from exercise are specific to what you do and how you do it. So maybe you are not under-muscled. Most of you probably are. You just don't have enough muscle to serve you. Maybe you're not as strong as you should be, or maybe you're strong enough, but maybe your muscular endurance is bad, right? All of these are potential problems. We can fix all of them, or you can fix all of them. And, but what you do looks very different than what the person who is under-muscled needs to do to add enough muscle back that their lack of muscle is not contributing to their poor health. It's important to know that these adaptations that you get from resistance training depend on how you do it, right? You can increase strength and endurance without adding size, or you can add size with or without significant increases in strength or endurance. Essentially, the world is your oyster. Just you need to know what is important for your body. But let me get back to something that I just said a little bit ago, and we'll close this episode for today. There's a certain amount of muscle mass that you need to not be frail. And obviously frailty is an extreme, but being under-muscled, even without frailty, is a real concern for your health. For any given height and weight, there is a lower limit of muscle that you need so that your lack of muscle isn't a health risk in and of itself. There is a medical condition and term called sarcopenia that simply means low muscle mass. And a lot of you listening are probably sarcopenic, either absolutely or relatively so. Again, being under-muscled without being truly sarcopenic, let's call that relative sarcopenia. And your lack of muscle is part of your health challenge, and you have control over that, right? Adding muscle will help you. Adding strength and endurance and maybe some speed and power will help you. Many of you that are listening are what we call skinny fat. And that means you're not obese, right? In the sense of your total body weight is too high, but it is possible that you can be at or close to your optimal weight for your height, but you have too little muscle for your frame. And that means that your body composition would show too little muscle and too much body fat, even though the scale and your waist measurements, for example, are normal for your height. And this is why the scale alone is not enough. You need to know if you have enough muscle mass so that your muscles are helping you and the lack thereof is not harming you. And in the course of this little mini series, we're going to go through some of the metrics that you can use to determine if you have enough muscle mass and should focus on things like developing strength or endurance, or if you simply need to add more muscle to your frame as your first priority. All right, I'll lock it down there. We'll call episode 1 of this mini series done and in the books, and we'll tackle some of these things and a lot more next time on the Inflammation Nation.
Thanks for listening to Inflammation Nation. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. You can use the links in the episode description to check out Dr. Noseworthy's self-learning programs for thyroid, detox, and gut health. Or you can submit a question for the podcast and even reach out to Dr. Noseworthy directly.